We're essentially celebrating two birthdays for the Recycling Center tonight. Its 40th and its 45th, depending on how you count it. The center began, the first bottle that was crushed here, August 5th, pretty close to now, 1972, 45 years ago. The city took it over. It was run originally by a group of volunteers who were associated with a nonprofit. The city took it over. It became a city program almost exactly 40 years ago on July 1st, 1977. I would like to dedicate this program to Joel Witherell. He was the rec director in the city, then community services for 20 years, 1973. If he wasn't here, the center would not be here. It would never have become what it became, and it would not be here. He did more than, a lot of people did a lot of work on the center, but a few did more than he did. What is important about the recycling center? It's funny, a lot of people tell you it's the first recycling center in, the universe. It's not the first recycling center in Northern California. It is not the first recycling center in the Bay Area. It is not even the first recycling center in El Cerrito. The first one was at the El Cerrito Co-op, if you remember that store. When El Cerrito's recycling center started, there were already recycling centers in Berkeley, Palo Alto, Davis, and get this, Modesto, okay? However, what makes the center so phenomenal is how great it is, how much people love it, the fact that it's still in business, and it's still run by the city of El Cerrito. How many cities run recycling centers? Not very many. As I give my brief history, you're going to notice there were several occasions in its history when it could have gone down, and it never did. That's interesting right there. If you look at our panel, you will see that they are all men. I have to apologize about that because I invited a number of women to take part, and maybe they were just too busy than the men, but they just couldn't do it. Women have played an incredibly important role in the history of this center, from Virginia Rice Mason and Kelly Falconer, who were some of the founders, to Jean Siri, who was on the city council and was a strong supporter, to Francesca Demont, who I believe was the first manager, to Nancy Gans. People who remember Nancy Gans really remember a very feisty woman who was a strong supporter and one of the founders, to Susan Catchy and Betty Dowdikin, who were managers in the 1990s, and to Maria Sanders, who's the current manager. When the center was rebuilt in 2012, 5 years ago, the city hired me to do a history of it, so that's why I learned most of what I'm going to tell you. It began in 1972. It was the era of Vietnam. The Earth Day was only 2 years old. Save the Bay was still a new organization. People were paying attention to how they could change the world, especially in an environmental way. A number of people who helped start the center were inspired by Save the Bay, the group that saved the Bay. A lot of them, but not all, came from the El Cerrito Democratic Club. There were people like Nancy Gans, Art Schroeder, and we had Ken Little, who was here tonight, who was not from the Democratic Club. So a lot of different people came together from different walks of life. There were students, there were older people. Rich Barkey was on the city council at that time. Rich Barkey, I just replaced him as president of the Historical Society, and he's in the audience tonight. He said that a group came to the city council and said, we want to start a recycling center. We said, that's never going to work. They said, no, we just need a little piece of ground and a couple of $100 on loan. We'll pay it back. The group is called EC, get it, El Cerrito-ology. It opened as a pilot study. It was just a test. August 5th, 1972, pouring rain. 33 people brought in bottles and cans. People were crushing them with sledgehammers. Ernie Del Simone, a member of the city council, he came in the early days crushing bottles with sledgehammers. It was volunteers. Pretty soon they made a deal. If you had a parking ticket, you didn't want to pay it, pretty soon you were crushing these things too. Joel Witherell was hired by the city in 1973. He was hired as rec director. He had already run a recycling program at UC Santa Barbara. A surprising number of people in recycling at that time got their start at universities. Okay, January 1977, a Saturday. By the way, the center was not open every day. It was open at first 1 day a month and later 2 days a month. But by 77, they were already collecting Christmas trees, cardboard and paper bags, and then it was opened every Saturday. The idea from the start, one of the volunteers, Virginia Rice, said, was that the city would take it over. We thought we should pin it on the city. That would be the best way to stabilize it. So the city took it over in, what year did I say, 1977. immediately started getting grants. They got a $45,000 grant to pay for a curbside source separation demonstration project. So for the first time, they were actually going around in trucks collecting recycling from the curb. So they had to develop their own vehicles. Back then, the federal government actually believed in helping people find jobs and actually making work. There was something called CETA, Comprehensive Education and Training, something around CETA. So a lot of people who work for the recycling, what?
Comprehensive Employment Training Act.
There you go, okay. A lot of people who worked for the city got funded by CETA. There were state grants, there was CETA, there were grants to buy a whole bunch of equipment, a pickup truck, and then, guess what? Buyback. In 1977, Kaiser Aluminum was here, and they started buying back aluminum cans. Pretty soon they started buying back other things. By 1978, they were buying back newspapers and just all kinds of stuff. And I remember, like in the early 80s, the late 70s, early 80s, when there would be cars backed all the way up, all the way down to Navalier, waiting to have their stuff weighed and to sell this. So it really got to be a pretty major thing. Meanwhile, in 78, etiology was a big deal. Not only were they smashing cans and bottles and things like that, but they were becoming an important source of information and even getting into politics in a way. They had a public information coordinator, David Tam, who was spending a lot of time on advocacy and lobbying. Some of the laws that later became statewide laws, they didn't necessarily have their birth in El Cerrito, but we, fed into them. Laws that, mandated how much had to be recycled. They even published a newspaper, The Recycler, and underneath the headline it said, "All the news that's fit to recycle." And also, they went beyond El Cerrito. By 78, some of the recycling trucks were going into Kensington, and they were going into Pinole. They were setting up offsite collections in Albany, Pinole, and Hercules. Meanwhile, there was so much activity happening here that some of the neighbors were getting sick of it. It was really noisy. There were just sound of smashing bottles. There were cars backed up, and they started to complain. So the city manager said, well, should etiology continue or be terminated? One or the other, continue or be terminated. And it looked like some people wanted to terminate it because it was bothering the neighbors. Joel Witherall, however, had a really good idea. He said, let's get rid of buyback here. We'll simply take stuff for free. No more buyback. All the state equipment that they gave us to do buyback will go to Berkeley. And I believe a lot of that equipment is still there. You can find it down at the end of Gilman Street. So in 1983, to keep the thing going, they set up an enterprise fund whereby all the funds they had from selling the material would pay for etiology, okay? Throughout, the idea was the general fund would not pay for it. However, recyclers who at one point thought, oh man, we can make enough money to support this by selling the material, realized that couldn't happen, so they needed to have some other source of money, so they decided to have a mandatory surcharge on garbage bills. 1983. By 1984, and I was covering the city of El Cerrito at the time for the West County Times, but 1984, the conservative majority, they weren't that conservative, but they were conservative enough, decided that it's not right to force people to pay for recycling if they don't want to recycle. So they got rid of the mandatory recycling fee. And people like Norman LaForest, who's still around in town and still very active, said, oh man, that's going to put the center under, recycling is going to die in El Cerrito. But what they did was, they asked everybody to pay a 50-cent voluntary fee. And guess what? Enough people paid it, and plus enough people kept on recycling that the center kept on going. 5 years later, in 1989, when Susan Catchy was running the place, they decided, you know what? We need a mandatory fee again. And so they did it, and nobody squawked. Nobody squawked at all, so it was back. 1990, a lot of spin-offs. Many volunteers would come. They created the book zone. The Boy Scouts built the shelves for the books. Marianne Hegeman, who's still around in town, decided that there needed to be a citywide garage sale. So she started that in conjunction with the recycling center. The first recycling in any BART station happened because a volunteer in town who came here said, let's start recycling at the BART station in El Cerrito. When the bottle bill came, where people could turn in their bottles and get money for them at little supermarket things, people here had kind of spearheaded that idea, but then some people thought, man, that's going to really hurt the recycling center. Well, it didn't. It kept on going. When AB 939 was passed in 1989, that mandated how much of a city's waste had to be recycled, cities all over the state were worried about that. We'll never do it. El Cerrito had already either reached that point or had surpassed it. Okay, what else can I say? I was on a couple of task force in the 90s and early 2000s looking at issues involving recycling here in town. Among the issues we decided was the idea of like having your garbage and recycling to the curb instead of having the guys come back and get it. Do we separate paper from plastic at the, a lot of things like that. But one of the questions that we had to face was much more existential than that. It was, should the city continue to operate the recycling center? How many cities do? Very few. Should it or should it not? Well, Ken Pisciotto, the chairman of one of these committees, told his wife we were thinking about at least considering the possibility of closing the center. My wife just about crucified me today. Okay, so that's my little talk. At this point, I want to introduce one by one our speakers. To the far left, sorry about this, is Ken Little. Ken Little was one of the founders in 1972. Today, he is an attorney with the firm Little and Saputo in Contra Costa County. He works a lot with developers of homes. And he's a great guy. He's going to speak first. Next, we have Alan Garner. There he is. Alan Garner, when they needed a glass crusher, and they went to some company that makes glass crushers, it just cost too much. So you know what? Alan Garner was an engineer, and he built it in his home right up the hill. Since then, he's enjoying his second career after engineering. He's involved with solutions to end intractable pain. I hope none of you guys are in intractable pain right now, but anyhow, he's a great guy. And next, we come to Tom Padilla. Tom Padilla. Everybody sent me their bios well in advance. You would think I'd be better at this than I am. Okay, Tom has worked in recycling since 1981, nonprofit, public, and private sectors. Since 1991, he's worked for Stop Waste, the Alameda County's Waste Management Authority. He is deputy director. He worked for El Cerrito in 1984 and 1985. Scott Hannon is a city manager and has been since 2001. Before that, when I met him, he was executive director of Recyclamore, which is the West Contra Costa Integrated Waste Management Authority. Before that, he was in New York working for the mayor. He was the liaison to sanitation and environmental protection departments. He also helped implement New York City's first multi-family recycling collection, something we're really trying to get going right here. And last but not least is Garth Schultz, who started here as a waste prevention specialist in 2006. He developed the program and the user experience for the place that we are here. I work with him closely. He's a great guy. He was the first manager of the recycling center here. Now he's with R3 Consulting, solid waste and recycling services to municipalities throughout California. Okay, well, let's hear it for Ken Little.
First of all, thanks for coming. We appreciate that. You need to support this place. You have to keep going. Yeah, I'm going to show you a little bit about what this place, or give you a kind of a close your eyes and sort of visualize, if that's the current term, what this might be. Take away everything that's here, everything. Make it a lot narrower, move the fence in, and make it all dirt. That was the first thing. But that's not where it started. You know where it started? It started with people just like you. We have probably one of the most diverse groups. I know that's a big word these days, diversity. We never thought about it. But we had people older than I am, currently, and people that were in their teens. Little kids would help. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, all kinds of people ultimately got involved. This, I think I'll do two things. One, I'll just kind of give you an idea what the people were like. Now, you're all too young to remember these things. But during World War II especially, and after the Depression, people saved things. So I grew up on a ranch in my early days up in the place where Idaho and Washington and Canada all come together. A little bit remote. But my job when I was small was to crush all the cans that we then bury, in case the government ever needs steel again for bullets. So we had them there, just in case. And then, when I was a little bit older, we moved into town. I had a little red wagon, seriously, and I would go along the highway and pick up all the beer bottles that people would throw out after 2 o'clock in the morning on the highway. So they got recycled. And those that broke, well, it's glass, which is silicon dioxide. It goes back to nature pretty quickly. Well, by the time that all happened, then I spent an all-expense-paid vacation in Southeast Asia. So when I came back here, I was looking around, and nothing was being recycled. So, and I happened to meet up with people that had kind of the same thought, like, what happened? We used to use things, we used to share things, we used to barter, we used to trade. You had a dozen eggs, you trade for something. You didn't have to go and throw things away. And plastic was just kind of coming into view. And I was studying, among other things, chemistry and biology and stuff at UC Berkeley. So I knew that the half-life of an aluminum can is 500,000 years. Now that doesn't mean it ends in a million years, it goes on for quite a long time. So that means it's unlike the bottle you throw out and someone's going to recycle, that can's going to be out there in the environment for a very, very long time. And then of course we didn't have to worry about recycling needles because I don't think anybody used them, as a matter of fact, for anything. But that's something that's come along. So that's the kind of people that met. I can only say that we started out just like you. There was a small handful. I don't remember why it started anymore. I know it's Nancy Gans and Virginia Rice, and I know Rich Barkey was involved more than he likes to admit, Greg Cook, Ernie Del Simone, some others. I think it started primarily at the Democratic Club. And I don't know if I was a member or not, a card-carrying member, but I went there for meetings. I know that. And it was down there somewhere around Pastime Hardware. That's all I can remember. I used to work there. So these people gathered together, and I was on several city council committees or commissions. I forget what they were called. I think environmental quality was one. Remember the future of El Cerrito, that one? Where we kind of planned long range for what kind of housing would be around the BART stations and a bunch of other things like that. Well, out of that, different people would gather around and talk about things, and one of those things was about recycling. And we knew that the city wasn't going to do it, or no government for the most part, because it just wasn't a big enough volume. And they would always say, well, there's just no interest in it. So we realized what we had to do was create the interest. So what we have tonight is something that maybe some of you remember. We have a case study in how government is supposed to function. You may recall from physics or civics or whatever they call it these days, if they teach it still, that our government was founded by people, just a handful of people. The Revolutionary War only had about 5% of the people supported it. So it was a small group, but look what they accomplished. But what they envisaged was a government that started from the ground up. So it's we the people, of the people, by the people, for the people. Well, that's the concept, but not articulated about the recycling center. There was just people, they saw a need, they saw plastic building up, they saw cans going everywhere, they saw things being just wasted, and they saw a need and they wanted to do something about it. And as Dave said earlier, going to people that were in place of positions of authority didn't always work. Not their fault, it simply didn't work for them. Recycling companies, I met with a number of garbage companies, refuse collectors and those around here, but they also couldn't make it work because even though they were into it and they'd done it for a long time, the way their companies worked, the franchises they had, all the different laws made it very difficult for them to actually just jump in. So what we had to do was actually create a groundswell of people, create an interest, and then teach people recycling as a way of life. See, when that happened, everything snowballed. There was enough people involved. I was here the first day. The sledgehammer was mine from working on the railroad. The yellow helmet I also borrowed from the railroad. The steel cans we borrowed from Chevron. And we only had 8 of them. And there was another guy named Chris and I. And yes, it poured down raining unexpectedly that first day. And people would drive up and kind of roll down their windows, and we'd take the bag and we'd go over and take care of it. Actually, I kind of like smashing the glass, and I had goggles that were from my shooting, and it went everywhere. So it was totally volunteer. It was people just like you. And you need to do the same thing that we did, was just generate that. I think the most important thing you could do is make recycling and reuse of things a part of your lifestyle. And we had questions about, well, it takes water to do this and do that. In those days, there weren't a lot of dishwashers built in El Cerrito. I don't know about today. I was the dishwasher. But I'll tell you one thing, husbands learn pretty quick. If you drop a few dishes, you quickly lose that job. So my wife was doing most of the dishes. But the idea is you have dishwasher water already there. You just take the recyclables, use the same water. So there's all kinds of things people have to be educated about when they go on. But after they started doing it, they got interested in it. They felt like they were doing something positive for the community. There's lots of positive things we can do, but we can't sit by and wait for the government to happen. We need to make it work up the way so that government can take over it and make it work at a higher scale. But first you have to have enough people interested in doing it for that to work. So I applaud you for coming again, and keep up the good work. You're doing a good job.
At the very end, we can have questions, but I want to have everybody just go through their spiel. Alan.
Hi, I'm Alan Gardner. How many of you have been a volunteer at some time? Yeah, pretty good number, huh? How many of you had your arm twisted to do it? Well, a smaller number, the ones that at least admit it. I had my arm twisted. George Farrow was a friend of mine, and he had another engineer, and he looked at the glass crushers, and he says, $1,500? And of course, that was worth something back then. So at any rate, this whole process brought me in because he says, well, if you won't volunteer to make this thing, we'll give you $400 for the material. You can come and crush the glass. So I don't know whether Ken was there that day. I came and looked, and then I volunteered. So the things that you do throughout life come along and do other things for you, and I've done a lot of volunteering. So the glass crusher was a little different. You know, as an engineer, you get this big plate of steel like you put on the street, and you take your torch and you cut it out into kind of little 4-leaf clovers, and then you make some fingers and you put this on a motor with spin it up, and you have no idea what's going to happen. You balanced it so you knew that it wasn't going to fall over. So we somehow got it down here, and I don't remember how because it was really, really heavy. We set it up somewhere back there where the blue machine is there. We turned it on, and it hummed really nicely. And somebody, was that you, Ken, put the first box in there? And I don't know that you're wearing hearing aids, but that was the first time I really damaged my hearing, was that moment, because we weren't smart enough to have hearing protectors. That's true. You remember that? So this whole process of volunteer work and what happens next is really interesting. So as I was listening to Ken talk, I'm going, well, I made the glass crusher, and I left. Well, I come down here regularly with my stuff. But from the standpoint of recycling, I didn't know any of the details of what was going on. I was volunteering in other organizations, and I didn't know about recycling. I probably threw a lot of things away that I shouldn't have. And so today, when I look at the things that I throw away, I'm going, no, I'm not going to do that. So Saturdays and every couple Saturdays I come down here with a load of stuff, and I'm amazed at the things that I go, wow. Just like you described, it was a little slot canyon. There was a few things there and a bunch of volunteers. And what I like about the whole process of where volunteer goes in, and I think Ken said it best, is that you have to have a groundswell. And what I see here tonight is some of the people that were part of that groundswell. Right? How many people were part of that groundswell? Oh, not so many hands. How about clapping for the rest, for the 2 or 3 that were in there? Okay. So now, the next step of where that goes is up to the other speakers to tell you what happened after I left. So, Dave?
Well, thanks a lot.
I'm done.
That was great. That was great. So what happened to that first glass crusher? It'd be great to put it on display right in the middle here. You still have it?
I have no idea what happened.
Probably recycled it, right?
It was good, solid steel.
Okay, so Tom Padilla will be our next historic speaker.
Good evening, everyone. My first recycling job was at a nonprofit recycling center in Santa Cruz, Ecology Action. Worked there from 81 to 84, and during that time had gotten back together with a former girlfriend who I'd met in Santa Cruz but had moved to Oakland in the meantime, and we started seeing each other again, and I couldn't get her back to Santa Cruz, so if the mountain won't come to Mohammed, I came to the mountain. And I had met Joel Witherell from El Cerrito in the course of recycling conferences and all, and Joel offered me a job up here that enabled me to move up to the East Bay to be with the woman who's been my wife for the last 32 years, so that was a good move. There was a common thread between Ecology Action and Ecology at the time, and that was an old recycler named Chuck Tapke who helped write a lot of grants to the state of California that got funding for this recycling center, and had also gotten some trucks and balers and things for the center in Santa Cruz that I had worked for. It was kind of a tight-knit group in that time. This is a great location for a drop-off center. It's almost in the geographic center of town. It's very hard to site any kind of solid waste or recycling facility in the center of here, but it makes it convenient. The fact the old quarry, dead-end street was great. There was the city courtyard across the street when we were operating the curbside program that could help work on the trucks when they broke down if there weren't any other city vehicles that needed working on. I was the assistant manager here. I drove curbside routes most of the weekdays and worked in the yard and as well on Saturdays. Did some marketing of materials. Gene Seary used to come by periodically and visit and talk. This was kind of a community center as well as the recycling center. There were just a few curbside programs in those days. There weren't very many. There was Davis, there was Palo Alto, El Cerrito, but it was not anything close to what it is today. I remember Joel Witherell wanted me to do a study to find out how many households are participating. Well, in the true low-tech manner of the way we did everything, I had a clipboard and I just wrote down every address that had a set out. We didn't have standardized bins. People put stuff out in brown paper bags or cardboard box. Sometimes they wanted the box back, sometimes they didn't. We kind of had to read minds on that. We had these first generation trucks that were high entry and exit, that you had to throw the bundled papers up. It was kind of a workers' comp and productivity nightmare, but in those days I was young and thin and enthusiastic, and we got the job done. However, I do wear hearing aids, and from between Ecology Action and here, I think the crashing glass may have done some damage. We had old equipment. We had an old portable that had leaks in the roof. It was not a LEED certified building. Right when I came here, it was when there was the furor about the 40-cent charge on the garbage bills that was designated as a line item, recycling, 40 cents a month. And there were a lot of people who would cross it out and say, I don't recycle, why should I pay that? My attitude would be, if you don't recycle, you should pay double. But I wasn't running for office either. It's a good thing for my just personal storage at home that I only worked here for a couple years. The mixed paper bin would have all sorts of treasures in it. I still, to this day, have a complete set of leather-bound 1918 Encyclopedia Britannicas. You could tell when someone had passed away, and then maybe the kids were cleaning out the old home, and you'd find all sorts of perfectly good stuff. So I'm very pleased we didn't have as much reuse in those days as there is now. When I left El Cerrito to go to work for an environmental advocacy group called Californians Against Waste, and worked on the negotiation of the AB 2020, the bottle bill that we got in California. That passed. I decided I really didn't want to stay in politics and got a job working for the San Francisco garbage company at the time called NorCal, now Recology. And very quickly, the city of San Francisco wanted to start curbside recycling, and I was the only one in their recycling division who had worked for a curbside program, so I got tapped to head up the design and startup of that program in San Francisco, and it really helped launch me on my career. So I owe a lot to my experience here in El Cerrito. I remember, one closing thought. When I started working in recycling in the early 80s, there were some Berkeley activists regarded by many people as sort of, kooks, commies, crazies, who said, within 20 years there's going to be more recycling trucks on the road than garbage trucks. And people thought they were just Looney Tunes. And if you look today at most operations, even the garbage companies, the solid waste companies, if there's 3 carts, recycling, compostables, and garbage, there are more recycling trucks than garbage trucks on the road in a lot of areas. So good things come to those who wait.
So for a number of months around, I guess it was 2001, not 2000, I was on a committee looking at what to do about rebuilding the recycling center. Everybody in the committee was really smart and intelligent. We came up with a plan, and then the city hired Scott Hannon, the city manager, and he immediately threw that plan out and ended up doing something much more smarter and better by, I think, rethinking the basic problem. So let's hear from Scott.
It took me how many years to throw that plan out? So there was a little bit of, sort of what's going on here. The city had relatively tough financial times in the 90s, and I think it really started to show here. And also, for me, it was trying to balance some of the stories you've heard with the volunteer nature, the desire to do the right thing. And I had always heard that El Cerrito was really at the cutting edge and a leader in all of this. And clearly that desire was there because the cars kept rolling up here hundreds a day, as they still do, even when the center was a fraction of what it is now. So it really became a transition period. And I think it's probably unusual for a city manager, but I had about 20 years of experience in this field. And it was clear that we had started to fall behind, and that it was time to go to the working groups and time to go to the city council. And to me, we needed to make a decision to either go all in or get out, because the equipment wasn't safe, the buildings were leaking, the trucks were old. I mean, the whole thing was about out of gas. But the will was clearly still here. And through sort of the work of the staff, the volunteers, the people like Dave, the people who just insisted this is something we need to do, because as has already been alluded to, there are very few cities that do this. And there are very few cities that spend $3.5 million on something like this, and not a single person comes to council in opposition when we're going to raise your bill a lot more than 40 cents to do it. And in my time, and I'm looking at Garth, we have not gotten one person to say that this was not a good use of your rates, your revenue. But when we came here, it was really time for an overhaul, and we really wanted to lead again. And we really think the community told us we wanted to lead again. And it makes me especially proud when I travel around. And while this may not be the only recycling and reuse center that does what it does, we are probably one of less than 5 in the country that is this comprehensive, and it's something that we really should all be really proud of. And it obviously would have never happened without sort of the will to get it done when it wasn't the thing to do. And I'm just really happy that I was involved and with people who wanted to do that and make the change and to build not only this center, but we now have state-of-the-art vehicles, we have a LEED certified building, we have almost no carbon footprint, we've expanded, you have the Goodwill trailers, the book exchange, now we're doing hazardous waste, we're doing paint, electronics. I mean, that was all unbelievable, I'm sure, 20, 30 years ago. And again, based on all of you and all of the people that have put in all that sweat equity into this place, it's really exciting that we, I think, are really, once again, leading the country in how to do this. And if every city invested like we did, you want to talk about global warming, if everybody had one of these, that would go a long way to solving the problem. So anyway, thanks for asking me to be here.
Okay, and our final speaker is Garth Schultz. Okay, Garth, take it away.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for being here, everyone. Take off the sunglasses. So I came here in 2006 as a staffer working at what was called a waste prevention specialist at the time, and ultimately what that meant, I was picking up the phones when you called. I was working with the drivers and Mario and the operators and trying to figure out how do we make this thing safer if we can. And there was, we had an open door policy on this little broken down office, and folks would come in asking questions all the time. And there was a couple of things that struck me right away working in that role, because I was kind of at the center of it all. Both working with the staff, working with the public, and that interface between what we were doing on our programs and what it was that folks were looking for. And I heard a lot of things. what can we do with this? Why don't you take that? I didn't know you were here. A whole variety of things that really influenced when we came to the point, and there was a huge, a team effort in terms of making this facility happen. Scott, Melanie Mintz with the city, the architects and the builders that we worked with. It was, a huge team effort. And what I brought to it was hearing from everybody over the course of several years. I came in 2006 and we opened this place in 2012. And in that intervening time, we heard a lot of stories from folks. And a couple of things that we learned were people wanted a one-stop shop. Where when this place had started, there were a few commodities that folks needed to find homes for in terms of recycling, and a lot had changed over the course of 30 years in terms of what we consume, what's available with our products and our packaging, and the things that we ultimately look to get rid of in responsible ways for those of us that embrace that volunteerism in terms of doing the right thing by our environment. So a lot had changed in terms of the materials that we were handling, and people wanted a one-stop shop. And the approach for other local governments, including this one, had been, well, here's a guide, here's all the other places that you can go to in order to get there. And they have phone numbers and emails, and you can, go ahead and find them. And what we heard from folks constantly was, why can't we find a way to do that here? And so when we entered into the design phase of building this project, my role was really to figure out how can we get those other partners here? How can we get Goodwill here more often? How can we get folks to handle other types of hard to recycle materials? By that point, curbside recycling in the Bay Area and here had been in a robust stage with nearly 100% participation in El Cerrito, but that was just for the curbside materials. What about the other things is what folks wanted to hear. The other main theme that we heard is that folks who had questions about waste and recycling also had questions about other aspects of their environmental footprint. Stormwater, gray water, conservation of electricity. And so that was part of what became the nexus for us in terms of making this not just a recycling center, but an environmental resource center that could showcase things like solar and stormwater and rainwater collection and how to treat water in the right way and provide other resources to residents who have those types of questions and start to not just think about the waste part of our footprint, but the other parts of our environmental footprint overall. So in terms of making this one-stop shop, we really thought about how people use it very carefully. We really wanted to make sure that we address some things such as if you came here prior to 2012, you would note that the route trucks and the delivery trucks and your vehicles and pedestrians were all in the same space and was really just an accident waiting to happen. And so we thought carefully about how is everybody going to get access to this place? Children, folks with disabilities, we want everybody to be able to use this in the right way and making sure that there was safe space for folks to be able to access the bins and materials, that it would be logical, that it would be clear, and that ultimately we wanted to be able to find a home for everything that you possibly could want to get rid of, a home here. Now, is it fully there? No, but it's a lot more than really any other facility. And I now work with local governments all throughout the state and primarily in the Bay Area. There are no other facilities quite like this, not with the 7-day-a-week access and 10 hours a day being open in this range of materials. And so ultimately, I think I want to bring it to a close in terms of, we heard how it started. Folks had an idea, they had a concept, they had the will. What drove this into the place that it came today was really the public feedback and the public input. Is, hey, don't tell us what you're going to provide us. We want to tell you what we want this place to be, and we really tried hard to listen to that, and I'm very proud of it today. I haven't been back in a few months, and it's just so fantastic to see this place and to see the level of interest and hear the stories, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
We'll be able to take questions in a minute, but first we have a message from Al Miller, director of the Steege Sanitary District. I think it'll be quite interesting what he has to say.
That might be a push. But anyway, if you live in Kensington, El Cerrito, or Richmond Annex, the Steege Sanitary District takes everything that goes down a drain in your house through your lateral to our main sewer, delivers it to East Bay Mud down by the Bay Bridge to recover the resources. The equipment that we use to clean those main lines is parked in our driveway, which is the orange and yellow building right across the street. And you're welcome to stop by, and there's a couple of crew members there that can answer your questions or explain how the video van works, how the rotor works, and how the whatever that biggest truck is called, I don't know, a vacuum something. Anyway, you're welcome to stop by and thank you.